I usually make notes for the class, and by mistake I deleted it. So I don't have my notes, and you don't have my notes, so I could say anything I want.
Now we got you mine.
Today, in the Hebrew calendar, is the 15th day of Sivan. Just 8 days after the holiday of Shavuos. And what happened on this day was the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson, of blessed memory, was arrested by the communist regime in the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union. I always love to add that word, former. And he remained in prison until the 3rd of Tammuz. That's like 18 days. But he was not released from, he wasn't given freedom. He was sent to a city called Kostroma in the Urals for 3 years. And then that was also commuted in another 9 days, 10 days, and he was released from prison on the 13th day of Tammuz. He was actually told about his freedom on the 12th, which was his birthday, and he actually was released on the 13th. So what is the significance of today? Today sounds like a very unhappy day, and it characteristically for the Rebbe, the previous Rebbe's son-in-law and successor, the Rebbe says these are very auspicious days. These days, when he was going through this suffering and persecution, are days that bring us purification and refinement and are auspicious days. They are very, very special days. So today is a special day. And what I'm going to talk about today is a little bit about his biography. And there's a book called A Prince in Prison, taken from the previous Rebbe's own diary, where he wrote up in very vivid detail virtually every little thing that happened to him. Not the entire story, and the other part of his story is based on several of his talks where he supplemented the information. But first, let me talk a little bit about him. Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson was born in 1880 in the city of Lubavitch. It's not really a big city. It's, I guess, New York, London, it might be a little bigger, population-wise. Lubavitch was a little village, probably a few, maybe at most 1,000 or so people living there. But it was the center of the Chabad movement, to which tens of thousands of Jews would flock throughout the year to be in the presence of the Rebbe. The presence in the city of Lubavitch lasted for a little bit over a century, and then because of World War I, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak's father, his predecessor, Rabbi Shalom Dov Ber Schneerson, was forced to leave because of the Germans coming, and he moved to Rostov. And the previous Rebbe moved with him, obviously, and then when his father passed away, and shortly after, he assumed the leadership of the Chabad movement. If I had to sum up his life, there's one theme, one thread that runs through the entire fabric of his life. We're talking about the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson, for those who came in late. He was a fighter. He fought the Tsarist regime. He fought the secularists in Russia, who were militants. This you're not going to read in history books written by the secularists, who leave out all the dirty things that they did to try to suppress Judaism. He fought against them. He fought against the Soviet regime. He fought against the indifference of America. But he was a fighter, but he didn't stand for fighting. He stood for bringing the knowledge of God into this world. The previous Rebbe had an incredibly powerful upbringing, and he writes about it in his diary. He was a prolific writer. I should mention that in addition to his about 30 volumes of philosophy, in which he expounds the deepest teachings of Hasidus, of Hasidic thought. Of all Hasidic Rebbes, his is probably the deepest, the most abstract and deepest. And he also, interestingly, he also wrote simple teachings for simple people. And he said once that he had to use the most profound intellectual powers not to write the deep ones, but to write the simple ones. For that, he had to use much more intellect, much more intellectual capacity. He was a prolific writer in many ways. From the age of 11 and onward, he wrote a diary every day of his life, except for Shabbos and holidays, obviously. He wrote everything that happened in his life, everything he heard from people. Most of his diary is still in manuscript. It hasn't been published. Parts of it have been published. But who knows how many volumes that could be. He also wrote about 100,000 letters. I don't know if anyone has ever written as many letters. The only person who has written as many letters is his successor, the Rebbe. But the Rebbe didn't write most of his letters. The Rebbe dictated them and edited them after they were written up. But the previous Rebbe actually penned them with his own hand. And even after he came to America and he was paralyzed, and his speech was impaired, and his legs were impaired, his ability to write never waned until almost the last day of his life. He passed away on a Shabbos, so obviously he didn't write then. But up to the next to the last day, I have some letters from him of his last year of his life that he wrote to my father. So he was constantly moving from one place to another. He didn't have a tranquil life for a moment. When he came to America, he came to America broken, fleeing the Nazis, and that's a whole story in its own right, how he escaped from Warsaw. He was in Warsaw when World War II broke out, amidst all the bombing, and he survived all that. And then he was saved from the Nazis by Nazis. The head of the Nazi intelligence, Admiral Canaris, who was an opponent of Hitler. He was a Nazi, but he was an opponent of Hitler. And later on, he conspired to assassinate Hitler, and he was caught and he was executed. So he got involved with saving the Rebbe from Warsaw. He sent a soldier, a hero of World War I, whose father was Jewish, and Hitler gave him a dispensation. He was I don't know what the title they gave, the Jews, or who had Jewish blood, who were really honorary Aryans, something like that. And he came to Warsaw, and he got him out there fighting the SS. There was a rivalry between the German military and the SS. They were Nazis on both sides, but the SS was much more radical. And he had to risk his life, this soldier, to get the Rebbe and his whole entourage out of Poland, to take him to Berlin, and from Berlin to Riga, from Riga to Sweden, from Sweden to the United States, where he came in the fall, the spring. What was it? The spring? About a month before Passover, he came to the shores of the United States and settled eventually in Brooklyn, New York, in Crown Heights, which to this day is the center of Chabad. The previous Rebbe, as a child, was already indoctrinated in a positive way into the idea that your whole life has to be devoted to three things: to God, to the Torah, and to the Jewish people. And whenever I say that, I know people are going to think, well, what about the rest of humanity? And my answer to that is that you can't love humanity if you don't love your relatives. You know, there are people who can't get along with their parents, can't get along with their siblings, can't get along with all the people close to them, but they love everyone except the closest to them. It's obviously something is wrong with that kind of love. If you love your own, if you love the Jewish people passionately as your own brother and sister, you will love all of humanity, and you'll do whatever you can do to help all of humanity. At any rate, the previous Rebbe, when he was 11 years old, he was already arrested. He was a juvenile delinquent. What was the story? I'll tell the story briefly. It's a long story, but I'll tell it briefly. The previous Rebbe would memorize Mishnah by heart. When he was 13, he knew the entire Mishnah by heart, word for word. And his father would give him money as a prize for his memorization of the Mishnah. And what did he do with his money? He started a free, interest-free loan fund to Jewish peddlers and peasants who needed money to buy whatever it was that they bought and they sold in the market. And these were all poor Jews, and he would lend them money without interest. This was what he did with his money. Well, one day he loaned money to a Jew, a simple Jew, who in turn bought a calf. And he's carrying the calf on his shoulders, and a Russian policeman comes over to him and arrests him, claiming that he stole the calf. And the Rebbe sees how this policeman, this burly, anti-Semitic Russian policeman, arrests this Jew. He runs over to the policeman and attacks him, 11-year-old boy. And of course, he was no match for the policeman, and he was put in jail. And he was put in a cell, and it was pitch dark. So what did he do? He recited what he knew, the Mishnah by heart. He went through the course of that night. He went through 1/3 of the entire Mishnah, reciting it. And he heard sounds of an animal. And it turns out that there was a stolen calf, but it was stolen by the policeman, and it was placed in that cell. At any rate, in the morning, his father wasn't in town. His uncle bailed him out, and everything worked out in the end. But that was the first time, and his father was very, very appreciative of his action. And his father said, "What you did was right. You should always fight to help another. And the fact that you were not comfortable, big deal. Don't get carried away with your own comfort when it comes to the well-being of another." So that was his initiation to prison. And then he was imprisoned another 6 times in his life. 4 times under the Tsarist regime, because he was also fighting the Tsar. The Tsar was an anti-Semite, we know. Jews who prayed for him, they said, "Please, God, keep the Tsar far away," as we know in the famous Talmudic Fiddler on the Roof. So there's one story that the Rebbe told the prime minister. He was first the interior minister, then he became the prime minister of Russia. His name was Stolypin. Stolypin was the most powerful leader of Russia, of Tsarist Russia, more powerful than the Tsar. The Tsar was just rubber stamped anything he said, and he was a vicious anti-Semite. And what I found parenthetically interesting, I looked it up on Encyclopedia Britannica. I wanted to know more about Stolypin, and not a word about his anti-Semitism. That he issued decrees against Jews. He was a vicious, filthy anti-Semite. But that doesn't get recorded in the secular historical writings. At any rate, this Stolypin had someone concocted a whole decree against Jews, against Jewish education. It was a very, very horrible decree that would undermine Judaism and undermine the Jewish people in Russia. And the previous Rebbe's father sent him to do something about it. And he said, how long? And he had to go to, where was the capital then? The capital of Russia was in Leningrad?
St. Petersburg.
No, then it was called St. Petersburg, right. So he sent him there, and he says, how long do you want me to stay there? He says, until your life ends. In other words, you should be prepared to die in order to get rid of this decree. So there's a whole story how he found out who Stolypin's mentor was. He was a philosopher, an older man, and he befriended Stolypin's mentor, and he was very impressed with the Rebbe, his knowledge, his brilliance, and obviously they didn't speak just about Torah. This guy wasn't Jewish. They spoke about general knowledge, and he was very impressed. And when the Rebbe saw that he's very warm, he said, I have to go to see Stolypin. How can I get into the interior ministry? Now, in St. Petersburg in those days, Jews weren't allowed, period. You couldn't enter the city unless you had a special permit. And here is a Rebbe who's dressed, with a black hat, with a beard and everything conspicuously Jewish. He's going to get into St. Petersburg and he's going to meet Stolypin, the anti-Semite. So the mentor says, you know what, Stolypin is a horrible person. I don't deal with him anymore. I have no contact with him anymore because he's so disgusting. But he once gave me a pass to the Interior Ministry that allowed me to go in there whenever I show the pass. I'll give you the pass. Just make sure you don't tell anybody you got it from me. And sure enough, the Rebbe comes, and there's Cossacks standing there with their swords, and they see this Hasidic rabbi walking into the Interior Ministry. That was the dragon's, cave. I mean, that was the worst place for a Jew to be. But when he shows them the permit and they see it's authentic, they had to let him in. And he went in there, and people are looking at him strange. Like, how does this Jew get into this place? And he asked people, where's Stolypin's office? He was told he's on the 4th floor. And he goes up there, and then he sees a man walking out of that room. That was Stolypin. Stolypin just walked out of the room, didn't see the Rebbe. So the Rebbe quickly went into the room, and he looked at the piles of papers, and he found that decree. And there were 2 stamps over there. One stamp was approved, one was rejected. So he took the stamp rejected and stamped the document and put it in the pile of documents that were already done with, taken care of. And he quickly left, and he averted that decree. How old do you think the previous Rebbe was then? I don't remember the exact age, but he was born in 1880, and this happened between 1900 and 1905. So he was not even 25 years old. When did he start working for his father and doing communal work? When he was 15. When he was 17, together with his father, he established a yeshiva, an academy of learning, where there would be very, very difficult entrance requirements to get in there. And the previous Rebbe's father said that this yeshiva was built, not like every yeshiva, it was built to fight the enemies of God. This was a prophecy because this was just a few years. It was started in 1897, just a decade or so before the communists would take over. And indeed, the students of that yeshiva all of the graduates were all involved in fighting the communist regime, many of whom lost their lives, were executed, and many survived, and we heard the stories from them. I heard stories from them firsthand. So now the previous Rebbe, 4 times he was in prison under the Tsarist regime, and now the communists take over, and he's summoned to the Cheka. The secret police of Russia changed their names. They used to be called the Cheka, then they became the GPU, then they became the NKVD, and they had another name, and then KGB, and now I don't know what they're called now. But so this is the secret police that tortured people to get confessions out of them, and they brought him to their office, wherever that was, and they started interrogating him, and he, of course, did not cooperate. So they took out a gun and pointed at him. He says, "This toy has made many people talk that didn't want to talk." And the Rebbe fearlessly said, "This toy can only frighten a person who has many gods, but only one life. I have one God, and I have 2 lives. I'm not afraid of that toy." And they put it down. But then, in 1927, things got a lot worse. There was an organization, it started earlier, but they really started to clamp down, an organization called the Yevsektia. Yevsektia means the Jewish section of the Communist Party. These were Jews who grew up in Jewish homes, some of whom had Jewish education, but became communists. They were really idealists, thinking, we're now going to bring the world to its senses. We're going to make the world a civilized world with communism, equality for everyone except for the leaders, of course, and anyone else who's as corrupt as the leaders to get power. But we're going to save the world. The Yevsektia were much more militant than the non-Jewish communists. They were ruthless in trying to wipe out, eradicate every trace of Judaism in Russia. And they were the ones who interrogated the Rebbe in a few years before this. Now, in 1927, it was the month before Purim. It was called Purim Katan, the small Purim, when you have a leap year. And the Rebbe said a discourse in which he referred to a story in the Talmud that Haman, who wanted to annihilate all the Jews, sees Mordechai, who he hated passionately, gathering thousands of Jewish children and teaching them Torah. And Haman said, I'm going to destroy all the Jews, but I'm going to start with the children. I'm going to kill the children first. And the Rebbe was giving a reference to the Soviet Union, the Obseksia's attempt to eradicate all Jewish education from children, primarily children. They were not so concerned about old people coming to shul on Shabbos. They're going to die off in a few years, so we could tolerate them. And even there, they made restrictions. But the children, we have to indoctrinate them, which is going on in this country as well. Public school education is indoctrination, but I won't go into that right now. But in Russia, it meant indoctrination against belief in one God, belief in God, period, belief in any religion. They have the same famous story they tell of the teacher telling the kids, there's no God, you can't see him, he doesn't exist. So a student says, I don't see your brain, so obviously it doesn't exist. I don't know if it's a true story, but it could have been true. But that's what they were doing, trying to indoctrinate children that there is no God, and therefore religion is evil, and we have to get rid of all religion, and especially Judaism. That was with a certain vengeance. The previous Rebbe had maintained a network of Jewish institutions. He had yeshivas for older students. The yeshiva in Lubavitch broke up into many different parts of Russia. My father-in-law, blessed memory, I think he was in a city called Kremenchuk, which is now Ukraine. There was a yeshiva there, and many other small cities, or large cities, but throughout the Soviet Union. And that was all illegal. When they found anyone going to a yeshiva, I'll just share with you a story I heard from my teacher, who heard it from the person who was there. There was an underground yeshiva. What does underground mean? It means it would convene in someone's house, and if anyone wanted to come in, they had to knock a certain way. If you didn't knock that way, they knew it was not someone that was welcome, and they had to take precautions. So there was a chassid who was traveling to that town, and in the street he bumps into a local chassid, and he asks him, where is the yeshiva? And he tells him where it is, but he forgot to tell him how to knock. So he comes to the place and he knocks the way everyone would knock, and the teacher and the kids, these are not little kids, these are teenagers, late teens, they hear this knock, and it wasn't the knock that they were expecting. So what they did was they ripped up all the text that they were using, so they shouldn't find any of the text. The kids all jumped out of the window. The window was not high up. They jumped out, and the teacher was the last one to jump out. But before he jumped out, he reckoned. I forgot to say, when the guy no one opened the door, he started saying in Yiddish, "Open up, it's me." And they got even more scared because they thought, this must be one of the Yevseksi who could speak Yiddish, and they're trying to entrap us. Finally, the teacher recognized the voice of that person. It was someone he knew, and opened the door, and it was too late. All the kids had already scattered, and the books were destroyed. This is just a typical story that happened, but with the greatest anger and vengeance was directed against educating children. The previous Rebbe had, I think, over 600 underground schools in the Soviet Union. And this they could not tolerate. So when the Rebbe gave this discourse promoting the idea of educating children, that the most important area of Jewish education is the children, because if there are no young children, there are no elders. No one's going to be around anymore. And Soviet Union succeeded in eradicating so much of Judaism that 70 years later, when the Soviet Union collapsed, most Russian Jews don't know anything about Judaism unless they had contact with someone from Chabad. Chabad had maintained this underground network until the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now Chabad is a welcome organization and has hundreds of centers all over Russia, and supported, believe it or not, by Putin. So we're living in different times, but that was the extent of the opposition to him, that he was maintaining the Judaism and promoting it. So they finally decided, we have to get rid of him. He is the worst counter-revolutionary. There was a chassid that I remember when he came out of Russia, and when the Soviet Union collapsed, they were able to get the files from the KGB and read what the files said. This chassid was sent to Siberia for who knows how many years. And the file, I saw a copy of the file, I saw it in translation, and I can't read Russian, but it said, what was his crime? You know, there's a name for every crime. There's larceny, there's murder, his crime was, he was a Schneersonsky. A follower of Schneerson. That was considered to be a major counter-revolutionary offense, to be a follower, because you were going to undermine the Soviet Union. And believe it or not, the Rebbe once said that the collapse of the Soviet Union did not happen in 1990, 1991. It happened in 1927, when the previous Rebbe was released from prison and was victorious over the communists. They wanted to kill him, they wanted to execute him, and he won in the end. And he was liberated and given permission to leave Russia. And he says, I'm not leaving unless I can take all my family with me. So they said, okay, you can take your immediate family. But the present Rebbe, who was not yet married to the daughter of the previous Rebbe, they were engaged, they said, no, you can't take him, he's not related. So he said, but he's going to be my son-in-law. He said, you can find other sons-in-law. And the Rebbe said, there's no one like him. So they let him out, and then he demanded his library. He had a library of about 30,000 volumes, and a very major Judaica library that was priceless. And they in the end, they packed up his entire library, and he took it all out of Russia with him. So in a way, that was a major victory. That victory caused the collapse. You know, if you do some damage to a wall, it's not going to collapse right away, but after a while, it'll collapse. But what was the original kick was what caused it to weaken. Its foundations were weakened. So I just want to share some things. This book which is translated from his own writings. He's very, very detailed, and if I have to read the whole book, it would take hours and hours. So I'm going to just pick out a few things about his arrest and his liberation. This is now after midnight of it was a Tuesday night or Wednesday morning after midnight. The Rebbe would see people at night for a few hours. People would come to him for questions, for advice, for blessings. And it's after midnight. He hadn't eaten that day yet. And he's sitting down to eat dinner with his family. He had 3 daughters, a wife, and a mother, and 3 daughters. And they were all in this apartment. And the Rebbe was extremely weary. He says, I'm not going to go into the whole background over here. But a few minutes after midnight, weary and fatigued, I washed my hands in preparation for the evening meal together with my family. Before 10 minutes had passed, the doorbell rang noisily. The door opened, and 2 men rushed into the dining room, shouting, we were sent by the administration of the Gepa'u. Who is Schneerson? Where is he? And within a moment, a unit of armed men entered, stood in line, and waited orders. And the Rebbe says, I answered coolly and clearly, I don't know which Schneerson you're looking for. If you come to a man's home, you no doubt already know who lives there. So there's no need for all the threatening noise. Say what you have to say, what you want, and whom you want. Besides, the official in charge of the courtyard is with you, and he knows all the residents by sight, so why shout? This was his response. Their spokesman responded, I'm not shouting, that's just the way I talk. It looks like you're not familiar with the ways of officers dispatched by the Gepa'u. Show us all the ins and outs of your home so that we'll be able to watch it as the law prescribes. Law prescribes. They were law-abiding citizens. And that's the paradox over here, that these people are going and doing everything according to the law, committing the worst crimes, but doing it legally. Hitler also did the same thing. before you, eliminate the entire Jewish nation, you have to find legal ways of doing it. Why do they bother even? That's the question I always had. Why do evil people bother trying to do things legally when they know what they're doing is certainly illegal? And the guy says, it looks like you're not familiar with it. Show us all the ins and outs of your home so that we'll be able to watch it as the law prescribes. You, as head of the family, will accompany us to observe our search through the house. True, I reply. I don't know the ways of your administration's officers, nor do I want to know them. It is clear to me that you have either made a mistake or else there was an intentional libel. And he goes on, says, I don't fear them, I shall not fear them. And as to the ins and outs of my home, the man in charge of the courtyard can show you around. My home is in your hands. You can search and probe according to your desires, or according to the law of which you speak. At any rate, I'm sure that you will not disturb me at the supper table. This cool and unimpressed response, or more precisely, the naive scornfulness of a Lubavitcher citizen left a deep imprint even on those rock-like men. Their wings drooped for a moment. They looked at me in astonishment. The house fell silent. No one speaks like that to an agent of the Gepu'u. They could have just taken out their revolver and shot him on the spot. That would have been nothing. A couple of minutes before, Nachmanson spoke up. Nachmanson. Sounds like a Jewish name? He was a Jewish lad from Nevel. Nevel was a town in Belarus known for its Hasidic population, who used to visit Lubavitch, whose father used to visit Lubavitch. His father was a Chassid. He himself had gone to school in Nevel. He gave the armed men their orders: go out and stand guard at the doors. If anyone wants to enter, open wide. But if people want to move about, even from room to room, or even talk with each other, don't let them. You've been warned. He turned to Lulav, his aide, from the Lulav family of Riga, another Jew, and added, let's get down to work. To me, he added, we won't disturb you from eating if you're able to eat. They knew how to frighten people, didn't frighten the Rebbe, and then they started searching the room of one of his daughters, Chayamusya, who married the Rebbe, and Shena, who perished in Treblinka. And they asked the girls, what party do you belong to? And they answered, we belong to our father's party. We are nonpartisan daughters of Israel. We are fond of the old ways of our patriarch Israel and detest the new aspirations. And Nachmanson said, but why? My daughter Shana answered, why? I'm not obliged to answer that question. You asked for my views and I answered you, but as to the question why, I'm under no obligation to reply nor to give reasons. After all, you didn't come here to rummage through all my notes and letters just for the sake of conducting a discussion. What we have always been, that is what we are now. And what we are now, we are telling you irrespective of whether it makes you happy or not. Nachmanson warned, you should really take into account our power and our opinions. The Gepu administration, which we represent, can open even a dumb mouth and make it talk about whatever is hidden under the heart. Our interrogators are remarkable craftsmen. People tell them everything. Over there's no saying no. Over there, people talk, sometimes willingly and sometimes not. Over there, everything melts. Even a stone will become talkative. That's the whole calamity, my daughter replied. People want to take everything by brute force. What a repulsive and unjustifiable thing it is to take hold of men with minds and opinions by the might of a fist and by the threat of a revolver. And the Rebbe says he was very pleased to hear his daughter speak like that. But he was worried that Nachmanson, who was boasting about his power and violence, that he may arrest them, which he threatened to do later on. It took an hour and a half. They ransacked the entire apartment. It should be noted, the Rebbe doesn't mention this, but this was known later on, that the Rebbe's daughter, who was engaged to our Rebbe, was looking out the window and she sees the Rebbe, who she was going to marry, standing outside, probably waiting to come into the house. And she says to him that we have guests. And as soon as she said that, the Rebbe ran away and went, I think, to the home of the previous Rebbe's secretary to hide all the documents or destroy the documents that might be incriminating. What do you mean incriminating documents? One of the accusations against the Rebbe was that he was raising funds all over the world. What for? To support the education of Jews in Russia. And to find evidence that he was getting money from other places was very dangerous, so they had to get rid of all those documents. At any rate, they arrested the Rebbe and brought him, and the Rebbe asked, I want to get a guarantee that you'll let me have my talis and tefillin. And they said, sure, you could pray as much as you want there. You're only going for a few hours, and then you'll come back home. And of course, that was a big lie, because they were planning to execute him, to shoot him. And the story, it's a fascinating story. When the Rebbe was there, he made a resolution that he's not going to show any fear, that he puts his trust in God, that everything that happens is by divine providence. And he was supposed to walk through a corridor to go to a place, which he later on discovered that when you go to that place, those are the people that are slated for execution by a firing squad. But he made a detour, not because he wanted to go a different way, but he saw another corridor that was more light. So he went there, and he sat down there, and then an official saw him there and started asking questions. They were confused, and that saved him from being executed that night. It was a miracle that he recounts. And then finally he demanded his tefillin, and when he got his tefillin, they wouldn't let him put it on. They said, you want to turn this place into a synagogue? You know, that's the source of atheism, the source of fighting against religion. And here the Rebbe wants to turn the Spalerno prison, the notorious Spalerno prison, into a shul. So they were taking up a whole long flight of stairs to get to the place where he would be incarcerated. And as he's going, the guard is behind him. He takes out his tefillin and he puts on the tefillin. And when the guard noticed that, he ran over to him and he pushed him down all the stairs. And he was injured. He was bleeding. His stomach was bleeding. And years later, he said he still suffered from that. He never fully recovered from the injury that he suffered then. Then they took his tefillin away. And he was put in this terrible cell. And I'm really condensing it and making it very, very brief. It can go on for hours and hours. They finally came to interrogate him. And in doing so, originally, he later on saw on the note that it said the death penalty. That was crossed out, and it said 10 years of slave labor, and that was crossed out, 3 years of exile in Kostroma. That was his final sentence at that time. So they came to give him the news that his sentence is going to be a lighter sentence. And when you come to give a report to the prison is supposed to stand up to show his subordination to the guards and to the officials. And the previous Rebbe refused to stand up. So they beat him. They said, if you don't stand up, we're going to beat you. He says, okay, do it. And they beat him. And then he came again, and they asked him to stand up. And he refused, and they beat him again. And whenever he spoke to them, he only spoke to them in Yiddish. He spoke fluent Russian, but defiantly he spoke to them, and these are Jews who spoke fluent Yiddish. He spoke Yiddish to them. And the third time, they were like almost begging him, why don't you get up, we want to give you good news. And they had to give him the good news. And one of the points, they asked the Rebbe, do you know where you are? And he says, yes, I know where I am. I'm in a place that doesn't require a mezuzah, just like a stable and a bathroom. Why did he say that? So part of it was to insult them, to tell them that this is a disgusting, horrible place. But part of it, the Rebbe once explained, a mezuzah is protection. What do you do when you're in a place where there is no mezuzah? Because it doesn't require a mezuzah and you need protection. By mentioning the law itself that it doesn't require a mezuzah, he fulfilled the mitzvah of mezuzah. Sometimes you fulfill it by putting on the mezuzah, and sometimes you fulfill it by not putting it on because it doesn't require a mezuzah. You're not supposed to put a mezuzah in such a place. At any rate, he was very defiant until the very end. Then they told him they're going to let him out. It was Thursday. They're going to let him out of prison, and he's going to travel to Kostroma. So he asked them, when do I get there? They told him on Saturday. He says, I'm not going to travel on Shabbos. Now, legally speaking, by Jewish law, he was allowed to travel on Shabbos to save his life, because as long as he was still in prison, his life was much more endangered. So the Rebbe once asked, why didn't his father-in-law, why didn't he leave prison right away? Instead, they postponed the trip until after Shabbos. He stayed in prison another few days. And these are not like prisons like in Buffalo, Attica or Wyoming, Wendy. Those are resorts compared to the prisons they had in Russia. And these prisons are horrible as well, but relatively speaking. So why didn't he travel on Shabbos? So he said, because the Russians, their whole objective was to destroy Judaism. Wouldn't it be a victory for them to say, even your Rebbe, even your spiritual leader traveled on Shabbos? So you see, we got him. He's no longer religious. And that would totally demoralize the hundreds of thousands of Jews who were still very much faithful and were looking at him for leadership. So he was willing to risk his life not to be a symbol that they were able to control him. And he left prison a few days later, and then the people came to the train station to greet him on the way to his exile. And what's miraculous about it, that all these people, none of them suffered the consequences of coming out to meet the counter-revolutionary. And he gave a message, a very powerful message, saying that our bodies may have been in exile, but our souls were never exiled. And as long as we keep to the teachings of Judaism, we are free people, no matter how much they try to oppress us. And he finally comes to Kostroma, and what was the first thing he did there? He sent even before he got there, he sent one of his Hasidim to make sure the mikveh in Kostroma was operating and functioning properly, which is the reason he was arrested, because of his counter-revolutionary activities, establishing Jewish organizations and mikvahs. The first thing he did in exile was to make sure the mikveh was there. Finally, and no one really knows ultimately what got him out of his death sentence and his slave labor and his exile, he was told on the 12th of Tammuz, which was a public holiday, so they couldn't give him the papers to free him, that he is free, and that tomorrow he'll actually be allowed to leave. But we know that there was a lot of pressure. There were people inside of Russia who were working to try to get him freed, but it was also in Latvia, one of the ministers, one of the members of the Latvian parliament was a Chassid, Mordechai Dubin, very, very righteous Jew who helped so many thousands of people. And this Mordechai ben Dubin had very close connections to the Soviet Union because they were doing economic deals, Latvia and Russia. And he put pressure. Later on, this Mordechai Dubin was arrested by the Soviets and imprisoned, and he died in prison by the Soviets. And there's a story, I think I told it not too long ago. I don't remember where I tell stories, so you may have heard it from me. When he was in Russian prison at one point, and they let him out of prison at night in the freezing temperatures of Russia, and he had nowhere to go. And he was only wearing his prison garb. He had no coat or anything, and he's freezing, and he's walking for miles and miles. Finally, in the middle of the night, he comes to a town, and he sees a house which had a mezuzah on it. So he knocks on the door, and the man opens up, and he sees a person dressed in prison garb, so he slams the door shut. You know, in Russia, you were terrified of everything. This is an escaped prisoner. That's all you need to take him into your house. And Mordechai ben Dubin was so weary he just lay down ready to die. And then a thought occurs to him. He says, how can I die? If I die and this Jew is going to wake up in the morning and see me dead, he's going to feel so guilty that he caused me to die. I can't let a Jew feel so guilty. So he puts together all his strength and knocks on the door, and finally the Jew opens and brings him in. He didn't care about dying, but it bothered him that a Jew would suffer a little bit of guilt, and that he couldn't tolerate that. That's how much love he had for a fellow Jew. And this Mordechai Dubin was instrumental in helping the previous Rebbe get out of Russia, but also the United States government. And there was a senator from Idaho one of the major centers of Judaism, Idaho. Senator Burrow was also very much involved. But whichever way you explain how he was able to be liberated, the Rebbe always maintained it was a major miracle, because Stalin didn't care about anyone. He didn't care about pressure. He didn't care about bad publicity. I think you get pretty bad publicity when you murder about 20 million of your own people. That doesn't look very good on your resume. And Stalin didn't care. So the fact that he cared about the pressure, that in and of itself is a miracle. And it's celebrated by Hasidim to this day. I left out tons and tons of information, some of which I don't even know myself, unless I read the book, but some of which can't read everything. If anyone has any questions. But let me just conclude. When the previous Rebbe was let out of Russia, he moved to Latvia, to Riga, and then from there he moved to Warsaw, and he established a whole network of schools, of yeshivas in Poland, to spread Judaism in Poland. Now, Poland was had a very strong Jewish community. The majority of Jews in Poland were Hasidim. Not Chabad Hasidim, they were Gera Hasidim, Alexander Hasidim, Radomska Hasidim, Belzer Hasidim, Bobov Hasidim, and 100 other groups. And they probably had the majority of Jews in Poland were members of those groups. But the Rebbe felt that there's something that Chabad Hasidic teachings would contribute, and he opened up a whole network of schools. Many of his students became the teachers in my school later on. I studied under a few of them. And then when the war broke out, my father, a blessed memory, was there when the war broke out and was instrumental in saving the previous Rebbe. The previous Rebbe told my father when he escapes to Latvia, he should tell Mordechai Dubin to start the process of getting him out of Poland. And my assumption is that Mordechai Dubin contacted the American consulate and the American government, and they in turn contacted the German leadership of Canaris, Admiral Canaris, who someone once told me that people think that he might have been a descendant of Marranos, because the fact that he was willing to save a rabbi, being a Nazi, shows that there was something wrong over there, something going on. At any rate, and he was taken out of Warsaw, and then he came to America. Now, the previous Rebbe, after he was released from Russia in 1927, traveled to Israel and then to America in 1929, 1930. He was a robust person. He was strong and powerful. My grandfather told me that the previous Rebbe came to one of the largest synagogues in America. It was the Watkins Street Shul, if anyone is familiar with Brownsville in Brooklyn. Anyone here from Brownsville? Yes. Well, you heard of Watkins Street? There was a Lubavitcher shul there, huge shul, and was packed to the brim, and people had to stand outside. My grandfather stood outside, and the windows were open, and the previous Rebbe gave a discourse, and they could hear it outside. That's how powerful his voice was. But the torture of the Soviets eventually had its impact, and then he contracted,
Alzheimer's?
No, he never had MS, multiple sclerosis. And that caused paralysis. He also suffered heart problems when he was on the ship leaving Israel in 1929. It was a few days after the pogroms in Hebron, where the Arabs massacred dozens of Jews. And some of them were the previous Rebbe's relatives. And on the ship, he got a heart attack when he heard the news. So he was a broken man. When he came to America in 1940, he was in a wheelchair. He couldn't walk, and his speech was impaired. There's one recording of him speaking that we know of. I heard of it. If you strain your ears to hear, you're able to make out certain words, but most people could not really understand what he said. When people would come have a private audience with him, one of his secretaries, one of the Hasidic rabbis, would go in with you at your request. So he would be able to decipher what the Rebbe told you. But it didn't stop him from establishing a network of day schools. The first day schools in America outside of New York City were started by the previous Rebbe in 1940 when he came here. And later on, another organization started, Torah and Masorah, and they continued establishing day schools. But the first ones were by the Rebbe, the previous Rebbe. And in 1950, shortly before his passing, he established a network of schools in Morocco for Sephardic Jews. And then he started a school in Melbourne, Australia. And if he would have lived more, he would have continued spreading Judaism all over the world. But when he passed away, obviously the present Rebbe took over and continued his work and much more expansion. Yes, you have a question?
Comment. Two things. That he was a broken man physically only. The second thing was, you said that physically we could be in exile, or the Rebbe said that my soul is not in exile. And the question is then, are we, in a certain sense, here? All of us, tzaddikim. And if we are, in a certain sense, you've never told us that. And I think that would be nice and important to say that to us.
We all are potential tzaddikim. Okay. Yes, in Isaiah it says, "And your nation are all righteous."
Right.
So that has different levels of meaning.
Right. But to put it out there puts also an expectation on everyone that I think is a reasonable thing for you as the rabbi to put on us.
Okay, I'm putting it on you. That we are all potentially tzaddikim. Yes, seriously. And the Rebbe actually said that now we all have the power to become tzaddikim. While in the past it may have not been so likely, we have much greater capacity to do it now. So you're right. But there are different levels of tzaddik. A tzaddik who is completely devoid of any desire to do anything wrong is the highest level, and that's not so easy.
Talking about teshuvah.
Yes, when you do tshuva, you become a tzaddik, yes. But one aspect of tzaddik. The Talmud says the following. The Talmud says, if you're a thief, not you, but if someone is a thief, and he wants to get married, and he runs from the bank that he just robbed, and he runs to the wedding hall, and he's out of breath, and he says to his bride, gives her the ring, and he says, "I'm marrying you on the condition that I'm a perfect tzaddik." It means if he's not, the marriage is not valid. So what does the Talmud say? We consider them married, because on the way from the bank to the wedding hall, he might have had a thought of tshuva. So you can't discount that. You can't say, well, he's obviously a ruthless criminal. He just robbed a bank. But the fact itself that he might have harbored a thought of tshuva, of repentance, transforms his status, and that you have to consider that marriage to be valid. It's not certain, but you have to consider it. And you can't just allow it to get separated without a divorce. So yes, tshuva does transform you. Any other questions on the Zoom?
Just a comment. When I was in Poland in 1977, we visited the mikvahs that he created in Lodz.
Yeah.
Able to see them.
Okay, I wasn't familiar with that.
Yeah, it was very.
I had a colleague, he passed away, whose father was a student in Lubavitch, and he was one of the fighters. Actually, I forgot to mention, before the Rebbe left, he called in 9 Hasidim, now it's a minyan, and he made a covenant with them that they should continue his work until the last drop of blood. And some of them paid the ultimate price. Some of them survived. So my colleague's father was one of those who survived. Not much he passed away. He moved to Toronto, but he didn't live much longer. And what he would do is he would forge documents from Moscow, going to mayors of cities saying there's an order for you to build a mikveh. And they would build mikvahs all over Russia. Months later, when people from the capital came and they found out about it, they closed down those mikvahs. But for a while, he was building mikvahs using the government as the forces to do that. There was a chassid from, I think, Samarkand. He was Sephardim. Well, we lumped them together with Sephardim. Chabad had a very extensive presence there. And this chassid who came to America, and I saw him at the Rebbe's Farbrengens, had a mikveh in his house. And the Soviets came to close the mikveh, but they had to do it legally. Everything has to be legal. So they said, well, there's a health concern. A mikveh, it's not so clean. So this chassid says, what are you talking about? He took a cup and he filled it up with the water from the mikveh and he drank it. Which I'm sure he would have never done under any other circumstances. There were no filters in those mikvahs. And they were afraid to touch him. So they left the mikveh there. It's incredible, the stories of self-sacrifice. My daughter-in-law's grandfather, Bavram Mayor, was criminal number one. He was like wanted because he was the coordinator of all these underground schools. He would raise funds, distribute the funds, and they were never able to catch him because he was hardly ever home, because he was always traveling. Once they decided they're going to move into his home, so when he comes, they'll be there for him. Now, when he comes home, he sees right away that he has guests, honored guests. So he makes believe he doesn't know his wife, and he goes over to her and asks her for a donation, like he's a beggar. And she gave him something, then he asked them for a donation. They threw him out. It took him a few hours to realize that was the criminal. And he ran away to another town, and they put up posters with his picture, wanted. You wouldn't believe that they had wanted pictures. And he had to hide on the roof of his friend's building. And he was there 2 months, laying down 2 months. And he said he had one discourse of the Rebbe. You could imagine how well I knew that discourse. And he was there 2 months, but he was never arrested. That was his miracle. My father-in-law, blessed memory, was also never arrested. He was interrogated by then Nek Enkevider. And it was the night of Sukkot. I told this story many times. It was the night of Sukkot, and they bring him to the headquarters to interrogate him. And they just let him wait there for hours. That was part of their technique, to wear you down. And then he realizes that it's Sukkot, I have to eat in a sukkah. So he climbs out of the window, and he gets to the home of someone he knew that would let him into his sukkah, and he eats something there. Now, I'm sure he didn't eat a full meal. He just ate something to fulfill the mitzvah. And he comes back, and the miracle was they didn't realize he had left. They wouldn't suspect anyone of leaving the headquarters. And someone asked him, why did you do that you risked your life? He says, it didn't even occur to him. He said, I have to eat in a sukkah. When you have to eat in a sukkah, who cares where you are? You go to the sukkah. There were so many... My father-in-law's brother was publicly teaching Torah, and people told him, "Aren't you afraid they're going to arrest you?" And they did arrest him, and they sent him away to the Gulag, and he perished within a few weeks. And the only reason we know that he was buried by fellow prisoners, because another chassid who was there was told by the people there was someone like you, a holy man. And we buried him. And this other person who came to America, Usher Vatumer was his name. Usher Sasunkin, Vatum is a city. So he had a story where he refused to work on Shabbos in the camp, in the Gulag. And they threatened to punish him. And they put him into a cell the size of a human being. It's like the Chinese type of torture. Usually people, after a few hours, surrender. He was there 29 days. And I can't say it didn't affect him. I don't know. I don't know how he was then. But they gave in and they said, you don't have to work on Shabbos, but you have to come to the work detail and sit there. And he told us that the prisoners there would tell him, well, you're sitting here, why don't you sing for us and dance for us? So he would sing and dance for them. That's what he did on Shabbos. There's so many stories like this. Then there's this chassid who came out of Russia when he was 70 years old. And he came to the Rebbe, and he was in the Gulag for 20 years. And the Rebbe told him, these 20 years of your life don't count. And he was a sick man. He couldn't walk right. He needed physical aid, a stick to walk. He was always in pain. And the Rebbe told him to throw away that stick, get rid of it. And he did. And he lived to the age of 100. Those 20 years apparently didn't count. And there's a book that he wrote called Suboto, of all his, I strongly recommend it. It's an incredible book. When it was published, he wasn't allowed to give his real name. It was too dangerous. And when he referred to the Rebbe, he couldn't use the word Rebbe. He had to use the word his grandfather because it was too dangerous. The Soviets were so ruthless that for many years, they sent spies to 770 Eastern Parkway. There was a chassid also related to me, and my son-in-law's uncle was involved in getting Hasidim out of Russia, smuggling Hasidim out of Russia, by giving them false documents that they were Polish citizens, and Russia was allowing Polish citizens to be repatriated, go back to Poland. So this chassid was doing all this, smuggling hundreds of families out of Russia, included in them as my wife's parents. I wouldn't be here today if not for him. So when he came to America, they came after him here. And there was one time where the Rebbe told him on Shabbos he should travel to Montreal to save his life, because they were looking for him to capture him here in America. That's how ruthless the Soviets were.
They still are.
Well, it's not the Soviets, now it's the Russians. But they're not doing this to Jews. That's the miracle. If you don't fight against Putin, he'll let you go. He doesn't harm people who aren't opposed to him. Thank you. Okay, so we can go on for hours telling stories. But